Hello, welcome, and a very good day to all of you. Uh, Thank you so much for joining in on this webinar, Active Directory Under Attack from Zero Access to Domain Admin in 40 Minutes. My name is Abhilash. The people here at Manage Engine call me Abhi, and I am from the AD Solutions or the Active Directory Solutions team here at Manage Engine, and I will be your presenter for today. Now, before we go ahead and jump in, I would like to thank all of you for taking out the time for being a part of this webinar. And I'd like to run a quick audio and video check because I'm working from home and I'm pretty sure most of you all are working from home as well. And I just wanted to make sure that my voice is reaching to you well and clear and the video is proper. So if you can hear my voice, if my voice is well and audible without any distortion or breakage or lag in the audio, if you could give me a confirmation using the Q&A tab or the chat window, that would be extremely helpful. Just say yes, just say okay, just say great, so I can confirm that my voice is reaching to you well and clear. Thank you, Lawrence. I hope everything is okay. I hope you guys can hear my voice. I hope you guys can see the screen. At any point in time, if you feel there's a lag between the audio and video, if you feel the audio is cutting off, if you feel the video is cutting off, just let me know using the chat window, and I'll do my best to get that fixed from my end. All right. If you've got any questions during the course of the webinar, please feel free to use the Q&A tab. Keep your questions coming, and I'll do my best to answer the questions during the course of the webinar. And even if I miss answering your questions, please do not worry. The last 10 to 15 minutes will be a dedicated Q&A session. So I will be answering your questions then, or I will reach out to you with a detailed reply on your email address. So if you ask any questions, please do not worry. I'll definitely reach out to you in one way or another. All right. So if you've got any questions, please do bear in mind to put the questions using the Q&A tab alone, because sometimes when you put the questions in the chat window after the webinar, the questions are not saved and it's a problem. So any of your queries and questions, do ensure that you put them to the Q&A tab, and the recording will be recorded, and the 45 to 50-minute recording today will be shared to you on your email addresses, maybe just within a day or two of this webinar, right? Just 1 or 2 days, and I will ensure that the recording is shared with all of you. All right. So yes, let's jump in without any further ado. The topic for today is Active Directory Under Attack from Zero Access to Domain Admin in 40 minutes, right? So what's the point of this webinar? What are we going to look into in today's webinar, and why Active Directory? Why domain admin, right? Now, I know and I understand that many organizations around the world are now adopting cloud services like Azure Active Directory, like Amazon Web Services, or even Google Cloud for that matter. And it's great, right? The remote workforce has forced us to adopt the cloud, and cloud is now an integral part of IT in organizations. But one thing to remember is Active Directory is still the core foundation of many IT environments around the world, right? So users, endpoints, servers are all connected with each other via Active Directory. So Active Directory still plays an integral role in many IT networks. Yes, cloud services are being adopted. Yes, cloud applications are being used, but Active Directory still holds its ground because the IT configuration of many environments, I'm pretty sure yours as well, is built on Active Directory, right? And we spend a lot of money, we spend a lot of time trying to deploy antivirus solutions, trying to secure our routers, our devices connected to the network, or even any external device, any network perimeter device. But one thing we tend to miss is the importance of Active Directory security, right? Active Directory is the central authority to manage access to the resources inside your network. And attackers, if they can compromise Active Directory, they can gain instant access to the resources, to the applications, to your users, and even to your business critical data hosted inside your network. An attack can be external, an attack can be internal. The ultimate goal is always to gain the highest access as possible, to gain access to the highest data or the most privileged data. And Active Directory is an easy pathway for attackers to take in order to compromise IT environments, right? So, like I said, the focus of today's webinar will be on Active Directory security, right? So, what's going to be today's agenda? I'm going to talk about 10 ways that attackers can actually use, 10 techniques that attackers use to capture or to expose domain admin privileges, right? These are 10 techniques in no priority order, in no specific order. These are just 10 ways I wanted to discuss today that attackers can use or can leverage to compromise your domain admin account. Why a domain admin account? Because domain admin account is one of the most powerful accounts in Active Directory, right? If an attacker compromises an endpoint, if an attacker compromises a user with no privileges, the attacker will always try to find a domain admin account because that's the quickest and the easiest way the attacker can get control of your entire Active Directory infrastructure, right? So we're going to look into 10 ways and a security strategy that you can employ to safeguard your domain admin accounts, and not just your domain admin accounts, but your other Active Directory accounts as well from abuse, right? Now, you would have seen this picture, you would have seen this flow in many, many articles or even in Microsoft documents that you've read. It's pretty straightforward, actually. There's nothing much to it. Once an attacker compromises an endpoint, the attacker will try and abuse the access that the endpoint has. And once that access is abused, the attacker will try and escalate privileges to a server that is located higher in the network hierarchy, like a member server or a privileged server. Eventually, the attacker will try to gain access to the domain controller, right? Now, the attacker's motive could be anything: to steal company data, to destroy the company's reputation. Either ways, if an attacker gains access to a domain user or a domain admin, it's game over, right? And the sad reality about Active Directory is that once an attacker compromises an end user or simply a non-privileged user connected to an Active Directory domain, it takes only about 24 to 48 hours for the attacker to become a domain admin, right? So let's start off, right? Before I begin, I'd like to tell you that these 10 techniques or these 10 scenarios we're going to look into are a combination of external and internal attack. If you take a look at the top corner of your screens, you'll find an external or an internal banner that will tell you if the attack is an external attack or an internal attack, right? So let me show you something very, very simple right here. What I'm going to do is I have performed an attack just a few days ago, right? And here's what the attack does, right? This is a simple attack where a user executes an Excel document, right? And once the Excel document is executed, what happens is a script is copied to the scheduled tasks on the Windows endpoint, right? What's the script going to do? Take a look. So as you can see, if I query my scheduled tasks, you will find that I have a script or a task that is running with the name keylogger. And what's going to happen now? What's the keylogger going to do? Just take a look at it, right? So do you see this? This is the logs of any keys that the user has pressed and periodic screenshots of the user's system or the endpoint, right? So what's this attack? It seemed pretty rushed. What do we mean? What's happening here? So what happened is that a user received an email and the user downloaded an Excel document or a Microsoft Word document for that matter, right? The document, when executed, it adds a malicious script as a scheduled task on the endpoint. And what does that script do? The script records the user's key presses, any key that the user is pressing. That's number one. The script takes periodic screenshots of the user's session, of the end user's session. And what does it do with this record of key presses and screenshots? It sends these to a remote FTP server, right? So that's this entire attack. It was pretty quick though, but this is how much it takes for an attacker to compromise an Active Directory endpoint. Just run a script, capture the credentials, capture the screenshots, send them to a remote server. And if the user has ever entered admin credentials, if the user had ever remoted into an admin machine, if the user has entered any credentials or any sensitive information whatsoever, the attacker will have control of that information, right? So I just wanted to show you this attack because now we're all working remote, and malicious Microsoft Office documents or Office macros is a real problem. And this is just one simple example as to how an end user unknowingly could download a document and execute it. And unknowingly, the user's screenshots and key presses will be sent to an attacker server, right? So it could start off like this. It could be pretty simple. So this is something I had gotten back in 2020. This is an email, a similar email that I received back in 2020. And what is this email? I basically received an email back in 2020 when the pandemic just started. And the email basically said that I have been terminated, and here is a termination list. I'm very sorry. And if I didn't know better, right, what I would do is I would execute the Excel file, I would download the Excel file, I would run it, and once I do, an attack like this would have happened, right? So this is not an email I cooked up. This is a similar email that I actually got back in 2020. An email stating that I've been terminated, and here's a list that has the reason as to why you were terminated and a list of other terminated people, right? Just a simple example as to how easy it is for an attacker to compromise an Active Directory endpoint with just a single Microsoft document, right? So it's important for you to realize that once an attacker compromises an endpoint, the attacker could escalate privileges from the endpoint and gain access to your Active Directory domain admins. The attacker could abuse any services or applications running on the endpoints. The attacker could try and access other workstations from the endpoint. The attacker could compromise member servers from the endpoint. The attacker could essentially take the data on the endpoint and leverage it, right? A simple example, if the user ever entered remote admin credentials, if the user ever entered any credentials, the keylogger attack would have captured it, right? So now that we're working remote, I wanted to emphasize on this that a simple log on to an endpoint, an unmonitored log on to an endpoint. It could be a VPN log on, it could be a remote log on. If you move to the office, it could be an interactive log on. No matter what the log on is, it must be monitored because it could be a security threat, right? So not just your AD member servers or your domain controllers, but your endpoints can be a great source of entry as well, right? So just a simple example I wanted to start off today's session with, and what opens gates to domain admin, right? How does it happen? So after much thought, I thought segregating domain admin attacks into three parts would be useful, right? So the first way domain admin credentials can be exposed or can be stolen is because there are certain settings in Active Directory or certain options that haven't been changed in a long time, or they have been left in a default state, right? So unchanged default settings is one reason why domain admin credentials can be exposed. Another reason is that there are certain areas in your Active Directory environment, which we will look into in today's session, that must be monitored, right? So if these areas are not monitored, then your domain admin credentials can be leaked as well, right? So unchanged permissions, unchanged default settings, and unmonitored areas is one reason. And another reason is permissions that are granted to your end users. Sometimes these permissions may be wrong. Sometimes these permissions may be too liberal. And that could be another reason why gates can open to a domain admin. And last but not the least, Active Directory, like any software, has its own vulnerabilities, which again may expose domain admin credentials, right? So let's take a look at what a non-privileged insider can do in Active Directory, right? I gave you the three reasons. I said unmonitored areas, misconfigured permissions, and platform vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities with AD can be a reason why domain admin credentials can be exposed or stolen, right? So let's assume we have access to an endpoint. Let's assume that the attack that I just showed you, the phishing attack, the Excel document attack worked. What can an attacker do with access to an endpoint? Right? Let's say the attacker has logged onto a support user's machine. The attacker has no privileges, has no rights whatsoever. What can he or she do? So let me show you a simple example right here. If I open up my domain controller and open up PowerShell, here's what I'm going to do, right? I'm going to run a command called get AD group member identity administrators. Once I enter, here I have all the members of the administrators group in Active Directory, right? Let me show you something else here. I'm going to run a command that basically is to get AD default domain password policy. So this is the password policy on my Active Directory environment, and this is how it looks like. This is the minimum password length. So all my passwords must be at least 7 characters. So now I know that passwords in this Active Directory environment have 7 characters. And now here's what I'm going to do, right? I have a script called the domain password spray script. I'm going to import that, and I'm going to run a command called invoke domain password spray. And I'm going to give it a password. That's basically password at 123. And once I hit confirm, we have a list of users and their plain text passwords, right? So what just happened here? A document gave me access to a user's endpoint, and with access to the user's endpoint and nothing but a simple PowerShell console, I was able to know who the administrators are, who the members of the administrators group are. I got to know the password policy of the domain. So I know what the minimum password length is, and I was able to launch a password spray attack, right? Where I got the user's name and I got the user's password, right? So all this, although I am doing these attacks from the administrator's account, it's important to realize that these attacks can be performed from an endpoint machine by a user with no privileges as well, right? Because a user needs no privileges to execute PowerShell. Any user can run scripts on PowerShell. And here's a script that gives me the passwords of other users in Active Directory, right? Now, you may have remote server administration tools blocked or RSAT tools blocked, or you may say, hey, these commands can only be run by admins and not by end users. That's true, but then again, these are commands, right? So there are different ways you can code commands, you can type out commands that can give you information about Active Directory. If your RSAT or remote server administration tools commands don't work, no worries. There are different commands that you can run using PowerShell, using the command prompt that will give you target-rich information about Active Directory, right? In fact, there are tools on the internet like the Go Dump Domain Info tool that you see right here. Where's the tool? Here you go, right? This tool basically runs on PowerShell, and it gives you all the insight you need about Active Directory. Like who are the admins, who are the enterprise admins, what are the domain computers, whose users' passwords are set to not expire. All of this information is useful for you to compromise Active Directory users from the endpoint. So this is the first attack I wanted to show, not really an attack, but a way a non-privileged user can survey Active Directory and extract target-rich information from it to plan his or her next steps of the attack, right? Now, let me show you something else right here. So here I have an application on my system. It's called the user ad. It's an MSI application. It's a Windows installer application. And what's the application going to do? As you can see, the application gives you the right to enter a username, a password, and a group name, right? So what I'm going to do here is just by running this application from an endpoint machine, I will add a user called a backdoor user to the administrators group in Active Directory, right? So let me show you the administrators group and check if a backdoor user was added. And here you go. Here's our backdoor user added to the administrators group, right? So this is one more attack I wanted to highlight in Active Directory where attackers, well, they are introducing something called malicious MSIs or Windows installer applications, using which they can add backdoor users to groups in Active Directory or perform any other backdoor changes, right? Now, how could this happen How can a user simply run an application and add a backdoor user to an Active Directory group? The reason this happened was due to a misconfiguration, right? Do you recollect the three reasons I told you? Misconfigured permissions, unmonitored areas, and vulnerabilities with Active Directory. This is a classic example of a misconfigured permission where this particular group policy privilege called always install with elevated privileges, well, this was enabled on a domain. And because this group policy was enabled, the user was able to execute this application under the local admin or the system admin privileges, right? Generally, if a user is trying to execute any Windows installer application, the user will have to give in admin credentials. But now, since this group policy option was enabled, always install with elevated privileges, this gives your users the direct right to run MSI applications or Windows installer applications, as you can see, with admin rights, right? System admin rights. This is just one simple group policy misconfiguration that may give a user direct admin privileges, also an example of an internal attack, right? Let's talk more about misconfiguration. Since we started off with misconfigurations, I wanted to talk about security permissions in Active Directory, right? Now, what are security permissions in Active Directory? If I open up my domain controller right here, right? Uh, you would have seen this wizard, right? This is the Active Directory delegate control wizard. So this is how you can give your users certain privileges, like to create other users, reset their passwords, delete users, modify users, etc. This is how you can delegate admin rights to users. And whenever you delegate certain privileges, what happens is on that OU where you've delegated privileges, right, the user's permissions will be modified, right? So this is my OU, RB, and whenever you delegate privileges, the security descriptor of the OU, it will be modified, but the user will have certain privileges here, right? So these are permissions on your Active Directory security objects, right? So every user, every group, every organizational unit, every computer has security permissions, and you can simply modify those permissions by right-clicking on it, hitting on properties, and then simply heading into the security tab and changing the permissions right there, right? So security permission changes happen day in and day out in Active Directory. Even when you delegate permissions, even when you right click on an OU and say, hey, delegate privileges on the OU, the security permissions are what are changed. And let me show you a simple example of a security permission that can give your users domain admin access that you may not know about, right? So do you see the system container? This is a default container in Active Directory, right? And do you see this container called the Admin SDholder inside the system container, right? So if I give my user, let's say, the full control privilege on this Admin SDholder, right? Let's say I gave a group or a user the full control privilege on this container, on this Admin SDholder container inside the system container. What happens is the user will automatically receive privileges on all these protected users and groups in Active Directory, right? So what I'm trying to say here is one permission change here will give the user privileges on all these objects in Active Directory. So if a user has full control on this container, the user will have full control on the administrators group and the domain admins group. And once the user has full control on administrators and domain admins group, it's no secret the user can make himself or any other user a domain admin, right? So this is just one example as to how misconfigured permissions in Active Directory could lead to a security incident, right? Watch your permissions, ensure only authorized users are allowed to change permissions on all of your Active Directory security objects. And last but not the least, whenever permissions are changed, do monitor them because you never know. Permissions can give your users admin access that you may not know about, right? Speaking of permissions, I just wanted to talk about one more way permissions can be misconfigured in Active Directory, and that is via group memberships. Right. So what are group memberships in Active Directory and why are they important? Pretty sure all of you know this, but groups give access to your files and folders, to your Active Directory objects, to any applications in Active Directory. right? So what happens in Active Directory is generally the members of groups are checked, which is great. But another mistake that happens is the nested group memberships are not really double checked, right? Let me show you an example right here. If I open up my window and if I head into my OU, RB, right? Do you see this group A? If I click on it, check the members tab, my apologies, right? If I click on it, check the, all right, group A, member of tab, you see group A is a member of group B, right? That's great. And these are the members in group A, right? If I open up group B and check the member of tab of group B, you see that group B is a member of the administrators group, right? So what am I trying to say here? Group A is not directly a member of the administrators group, but group A is nested into another group who is a member of the administrators group. So indirectly, group A happens to be an administrator, right? So this is something I want to talk about. Nested group memberships is a problem. Groups are nested inside each other. Users are nested inside nested groups, and this leads to confusion. So do check your group memberships. Ensure only authorized users are members of groups, and do not forget to check the groups nested into other groups, right? One more thing I want to talk about is certain groups that have privileges that you may not know about, right? So for example, let's say you install an on-premises Exchange server, right? So when you install an on-premises Exchange server, right, it has a few groups like the Exchange Windows Permissions group that has rights on the Active Directory domain itself, right? Now, what do I mean by this? If I open up my Active Directory users and computers, right? This is my domain node, right? It's called the domain DNS node, right? So if I right click on it, head into properties, head into the security tab, right? Any permission changer will apply to all the objects on the domain, right? So any user who's a member of this group, the Exchange Windows Permissions group, will have the right to modify permissions on the domain DNS node. So the user could give himself or any other user full control over the domain. The user could give himself or any other user the rights to modify the policies on the domain, like write domain password policies or lockout policies. Or the user can give himself or a group or any other user privileges called the replicating directory changes privileges, right? So what are these privileges on the domain node? The replicating directory changes privileges are used in Active Directory by the domain controllers to update each other of the changes, right? Let's say there's DC1, let's say there's DC2, right? So if there's a change in DC1, DC1 uses an account with the replicating directory changes privileges to update DC2 of that change, right? So it's like a push and pull request, right? For example, a user's password is changed. The password will be sent to another domain controller using these privileges called the replicating directory changes privileges, right? Similarly, for any other object in Active Directory. So what am I trying to say here? A user who's a member of the Exchange Windows Permissions group can modify permissions on the domain level, right? That's point number one. So the user can give himself full control over the domain, or the user can assign himself certain privileges called replicating directory changes privileges, right? So what are these privileges? How can a user abuse these? Now, using these permissions, using these rights, a user can pretend to be a domain controller and ask for password hashes or request for password hashes from other domain controllers, right? This is an example of a domain controller simulation attack or pretending to to be a domain controller attack, also known as the Mimikatz DC sync attack, right? So just an example as to how a misconfigured group can give a user rights and how a user can leverage those rights to compromise your Active Directory domain and eventually become a domain admin, right? So with the replicating directory changes, the user could pretend to be a domain controller, right? Simulate the behavior of a domain controller and get access to the password hashes of any user, including your domain admins, right? So here are three things I want you to do here. Number one, watch your built-in groups like domain admins, enterprise admins, check for their memberships, check for groups nested into these groups. And whenever you install a software like Exchange or any other software, whenever that software creates groups on your Active Directory domain, ensure that these groups have only the privileges they need. Do double check these new groups for any admin privileges that they may have. And if they do have admin privileges, do double check the members of these groups, because if users are added to these groups, they'll automatically get the admin privileges, right? This is just an example as to how a group membership can give a user the replicating directory changes and how the user can leverage those rights to request password hashes of any user on the domain, right? So enough misconfigurations. We spoke about group misconfigurations. We spoke about permission misconfigurations. We spoke about group policy misconfigurations that can lead to incidents. Let's talk about vulnerabilities in AD, right? So Active Directory as a software, like any software in this world, has its own set of vulnerabilities that you need to check, right? Day after day, new vulnerabilities are being introduced with Active Directory. Microsoft is patching these vulnerabilities, and I would encourage you to keep in sync with these vulnerabilities and patch your domain controllers as soon as possible, right? So here is one example. This vulnerability happened back in 2020, probably around October of 2020, I think. And this is called the zero logon attack or the net logon vulnerability in Active Directory. Now, what is this vulnerability? I do not want to complicate this because this can get a bit too technical. So what I'm going to say here is in Active Directory, client systems have to authenticate with domain controllers. And when client systems authenticate with domain controllers, they use a protocol called the net logon protocol, right? So what is the net logon protocol? It's basically an authentication protocol, right? There was a flaw within the netlogon protocol, the authentication protocol that authenticates domain joint systems with the domain controller that attackers could leverage to impersonate any server on the domain, right? So in short, the attacker could pretend to be a domain controller. The attacker could pretend to be a member server. And all the attacker had to do was enter a password that was nothing but a bunch of zeros, right? So this is a flaw within an authentication protocol with the client system and a domain controller that the attackers have been leveraging to basically impersonate any server on your domain, including your domain controllers. Because now with this flaw, all they need to do is enter a password that is nothing but null or a bunch of zeros, and they can impersonate any server on the domain, including your domain controllers, thereby granting themselves access to domain admin, right? So do click on this, patch your domain controllers as soon as possible. If you wish to read more about it, here's what I'd suggest. Head into Manage Engine Blogs. And once you head into Manage Engine Blogs, uh, just hit search and just type in zero access, right? So once you type in zero access, you should find my blog right here where I've spoken about in depth about the zero logon attack and how it can be prevented. So I'm going to quickly leave a link to this in the chat right now. So if you're interested, if you want to learn more about this attack, do take a look at it. This blog will tell you everything you need to know. All right. So this is something that's important. So vulnerabilities like this keep coming in Active Directory. Do keep an eye out, do patch your domain controllers. And Microsoft always introduces certain workarounds for these vulnerabilities, right? For example, Microsoft introduced an option, a group policy option called allow vulnerable net logon secure channel connections, right? So what is this? Why is it allowing vulnerable net logon connections? Now, in Windows environments, what happens is there are certain non-compliant devices that this patch that you see, it cannot be applied to these devices. In that case, Microsoft has given you a special right or a privilege to basically name those devices right here, right? So once you name those devices right here, you're basically authorizing those devices to use a vulnerable net logon secure channel connection, right? So just something I wanted to add, patch your domain controllers, point number one. Point number two, do take a look at this register, at this group policy setting where you can add devices, again, your non-compliant devices to which this patch cannot be applied to, so they can use the vulnerable net logon connection uh, to work to authenticate with the domain controllers, right? At the same time, it's important that once you look at these vulnerabilities, once you patch them, you should also monitor these vulnerabilities for exploit. And that's something we can help you with. So for example, if I head into AD Audit Plus, Server Audit, we've got something called Net Logon Vulnerable Channel Audit right here that basically audits this vulnerability exploitation, right? So if there is a device or a server that is allowed to use this vulnerable connection, then you get a report right here, right? If there's a device in the group policies that is allowed to use a vulnerable net logon connection, you get a report right here, right? If a device that's actually not allowed to use this connection but is still trying to use it, it could be an attack attempt, and you get the report right here as well. So do monitor any devices who are allowed to use connections, and do monitor any devices that are denied to use connections, because this could be an attacker trying to break into your Active Directory environment using this vulnerability, right? Just an example of a vulnerability in AD, a default vulnerability. Do patch them, do check out everything Microsoft has written about them, and do monitor them later on for exploitations. Don't just patch the vulnerabilities and and let them be. I would encourage that you monitor them for further exploitation as well, right? So yes, we spoke about misconfigurations. We spoke about a default vulnerability in AD that can be abused. Active Directory can also be subject to ransomware attacks. In fact, Active Directory is more targeted in ransomware attacks right about now. More now that we're all working remote, phishing attacks have increased and ransomware attacks have increased. And I wanted to talk about a specific ransomware attack that is targeting Active Directory environments. And this attack is called the Snake ransomware attack, right? So what's the Snake ransomware attack? What does it do? How is it different from other ransomware attacks? So what the Snake ransomware attack does is it basically leverages your built-in Active Directory tools or features or protocols to propagate or to spread within your Active Directory network, right? For example, this ransomware, the Snake ransomware attack, it disables WMI. So basically, WMI is a protocol in Active Directory environments where remote changes can be deployed to other servers from a central server. Basically, a remote change deployment protocol. The Snake ransomware attack kills processes in your Active Directory. Like if you have a backup process in Active Directory, if you have any security process running in Active Directory, if you have the Windows event viewer in Active Directory that you're using to audit changes, what this ransomware attack does is it disables or it blocks those tools, right? And once it disables remote management, once it blocks certain processes like backup processes or event logging processes, it uses Windows features, right? Like group policies to spread from one server to another, right? It is speculated that the Snake ransomware attack propagates using the sysvol folder. You know what the sysvol folder is? I'm pretty sure you do. So the sysvol folder is in domain controllers. And what the sysvol folder does, what it basically does is it is used to propagate your group policy settings, right? So you already have group policies on your domain. And what the sysvol folder does is it propagates the computer configuration and the user configuration settings to all the servers in your network, right? That's the job of the sysvol folder on a domain controller. So what this ransomware attack does is it places the malicious files that are known by this name, nmon.exe, nmon.pat, in the sysvol folder. And the sysvol folder, a legitimate Active Directory tool, is used to propagate ransomware, this time instead of group policy settings, right? So this brings me to my third point. I showed you how misconfigurations can lead to incidents. I showed you how vulnerabilities can be exploited in Active Directory. And this is one reason as to why you need to monitor everything that's happening in Active Directory. If remote management is disabled, you need to know that. If processes are being killed, you need to know that. If new processes are being started, like nmon.exe, if changes are being made to your critical folders, like your group policy folders, you need to be aware of that because these could be indications of a ransomware attack, right? This is an example as to how unmonitored areas in your Active Directory environment could lead to a security incident. Here's one more such example, right? Now, many of you have heard of mimikatz, right? Used to extract credentials from Active Directory, but now what's happening is many antivirus solutions, they can block mimikatz. They can stop mimikatz from executing, making your Active Directory environment more secure. So what are attackers doing? They are using built-in Windows tools like the Task Manager to basically create memory dumps of the LSASS process, right? This is the local security authority. So what attackers do is they create a dump of this, and then they take the dump home. They run mimikatz on their own server and extract credentials from it, right? Such a sophisticated attack, but everything is done with PowerShell and a built-in Windows tool like Task Manager. All the attacker needs to do is create a dump file, go home and extract the dump file, right? We generally don't monitor such things. We don't monitor dump attempts in your Active Directory environments. And it's something you need to do because attacks are getting more sophisticated, right? Here's one more such example as to why monitoring is important, right? So let's say an attacker has access to an endpoint, right? Let's say any endpoint the attacker has access to, or let's say an inside user has gone rogue, and let's say the attacker has pasted a malicious document like the termination list I showed you earlier on the endpoint, right? So any user who publicly accesses this file share can execute this file and spread ransomware from one workstation to another, right? So this is an example of an attack where an attacker places an infected document inside a public share and the users execute that document not knowing what it is, doing the job of spreading the ransomware or the malware for the attacker, right? So you need to secure your file and folder permissions. You need to check who your owners of your files and folders are. And whenever files are modified, permissions are changed, files are deleted, moved in your network shares or on your member servers, you need to monitor those changes as well, right? One more thing I'd like to say is you need to absolutely look at your core system files and folders. You've got your system root folders on your Linux systems. You've got your program files 86. You've got your sysvol folders, also a critical folder on your domain controllers, right? So not just monitoring your data for changes, monitor your security files and folders, like your app, database, configuration, OS files and folders for changes, right? Because you never know, permissions can be misused in one way or the other. And like I said, it's not just permission misuse, attackers are becoming very smart. All they got to do is place an infected document in a publicly accessible share and compromise every other server on the network. Because in this case, the attacker is using the end users as catalysts to spread the ransomware attack, right? One more thing I want to talk about is the difficulty in creating a malicious document, right? So how hard is it to create an infected Microsoft Office document, like an Excel document or a Word document, right? Let me show you something right here. Do you see the script called Lucky Strike? What is the script? It's basically a PowerShell-based utility for the creation of malicious Office macro documents. So using this script, you can create an Office document that is infected with malware. So you can embed a PowerShell script inside an Office document. You can embed a command in an Office document, and the moment the user executes the document, the script or the command will do its work, right? So it's that simple. All you need is a PowerShell script, and you can create malicious Office documents, and then attacks can take place. Here is one such example where a victim clicks on a document inside a share, right? Inside a publicly accessible share. And once the victim clicks, the attacker will have complete control of the victim's session. This is an example of a remote control attack, right? So again, one more example here where an attacker can extract credentials from your NTDS.dit file in Active Directory. Right now, let me show you something right here. This is your NTDS.dit file. So this is the heart of your Active Directory. This file has your users, their passwords, everything in it, right? And when you try to open it, right, what happens is you can never open it. You get an error because this file is always in use by Active Directory. This is your Active Directory database, right? So you cannot copy this file, you cannot open this file, you cannot do anything with this dit file, right? So what do attackers do is they create shadow copies of this file, also known as volume shadow copies, right? And then they take that copied file, the shadow copy of that file, and try and extract credentials from it. So if an attacker is able to access a DC, he or she can access the NTDS.dit file, create a volume shadow copy, and extract credentials from that file, right? So we cannot manually copy this, but volume shadow copies will let you copy this particular file, right? Just another attack that we typically don't look for in an Active Directory environment, right? So it's important to note that attacks are not always this complicated, but pretty simple as well, right? For example, let's say there's an account lockout on your domain and you got a call from your user saying, hey, can you please unlock my account, right? I would encourage you to check out the reason behind the account lockout and then unlock the account, right? If there could be a logon failure on your member server, on your workstation, on your domain controller, it's important that you look into the reason behind the logon failure, why the logon failure is occurring. Is it a password attack attempt? Is it a genuine attempt? Right? So we spoke about how unmonitored areas like the attacks that I just showed you, we spoke about how misconfigurations could lead to an attack. We spoke about how vulnerabilities within AD could lead to an attack, and it doesn't end here. A simple deviation from an end user's behavior could lead to an Active Directory attack. For example, if a user is logging on to a server at 2 a.m. in the morning, it could be something wrong, right? If a user is trying to copy a bunch of files or move a bunch of files from one location to another and is failing at it, it could be an attack attempt, right? And you need to monitor all aspects of your Active Directory 24/7, and that's the only way you can detect such attack attempts in Active Directory, right? And we can help you with that because in Log 360, we have a module called AD Audit Plus that monitors your entire Active Directory infrastructure. Right from logons, you get to know why logon failures are happening, right? You get to analyze why a logon failure happened, but you get to realize, hey, this is the reason behind the logon failure. This is why a logon failure happened. Probably an older application or an older process is using the user's expired credentials. Probably it is a brute force attack attempt. No matter what it is, you get to know the reason. So what I'm trying to say here is the reports that you see right here will monitor your Active Directory environment in real time, right? So if there's a logon activity happening across your member servers, your workstations, if there's a user who was created, if there's a user who was moved, if there's an attribute change on the user, you get to monitor those changes. If there's an attribute change or any change in your objects like groups, computers, OUs, group policies, you get to monitor those changes, right? If there are permission changes on your domain, on your OUs, on your users, on your groups, you get to monitor those changes in your real time. And not just that, if there are changes across your files and folders, like Windows file servers, file clusters, NetApp, EMC, you can monitor those changes, right? And not just that, if there are other security changes across your member servers, your workstations, or even your workgroup machines, you can monitor those changes with AD Audit Plus. For example, here's how you can track PowerShell scripts that are executed in your environment. So since most attacks are script-based, you can monitor scripts that are executed by your end users. You can read into the code block of the script. You can monitor commands that are executed by your end users on PowerShell. You can look into devices that are being plugged in, like USB devices. You can monitor your core system files and folders, like system root, C, program files 86, your data, your application folders. your OS folders. You can monitor all of those folders with file integrity monitoring right here. You can monitor things like processes, scheduled tasks that were created, that were modified, new processes that were created, that were exited, which could be indications of a phishing attack, like the Excel document I showed you, or a ransomware attack where new processes are being created and legitimate Windows processes are being exited. And not just that, you can read into your user behavior, right? For example, if a user is accessing a host for the first time, this is an anomaly. This is not something a user generally does. So you can look into that, right? If new processes are being spawned on servers, a new mysterious process that you do not know about, again, a deviation between typical user behavior, you can monitor those changes. If there are unusual amount of files modified, deleted, you can capture those changes. So the analytics report right here will help you capture any uh, behavioral related change, right? So just this one console with the reports, you can look into all changes in your Active Directory, all object-based changes, attribute changes, permission changes. With this, you can look into your data changes. With this, you can look into the changes on your servers, like your member servers, workstations, etc. And you can, of course, configure alerts as well, right? So you can create an alert profile. You can leverage built-in alerts that we give you with AD Audit Plus, where the admins will be notified via email, via SMS about the alert. Whenever there's something wrong with Active Directory, you will immediately receive an alert, right? You can set up customized alerts. For example, if there's anything happening outside of business hours, you can set up an alert. You can filter alerts based on usernames, server names, attribute values. The list simply goes on. So you can set up alerts. You can notify the authorized users, and not just set up alerts. You have the ability to remediate an alert that you set up as well, right? So let's say there's a password spray attack attempt, right? And you captured the user who's trying to perform the password spray attack attempt, and you are alerted on it, right? And the script here will basically disable that malicious user or terminate that user's session. So the script here will act as a remedial action, right? One more example for this. Let's say there is a group membership change, right? An admin group membership was changed outside of business hours. So you received an alert. And the script here will disable the user who was added to the group outside of business hours. So the next day you can come back to office and check if the user who was added to the group is indeed legitimate, right? So just as one console AD Audit Plus, a component of Log 360 that you can leverage to monitor your AD files and folders, member servers, etc. Right? I wanted to talk about one more component that's called the Event Log Analyzer component of Log 360. And why is this important? The truth is, most Active Directory related reporting can be done by AD Audit Plus, but sometimes you need to look in depth, right? For example, you may need to search for a specific log across a specific device, right? Like your Windows devices. And you may need to search for a log based on certain conditions, right? Like and or conditions that could help you detect advanced attack attempts. The task manager memory dump attack I showed you, or the NTDS extraction attack are all advanced attacks. And for those, you need to look through the logs, set up specific alerts that will help you mitigate, right? So how is Event Log Analyzer different from AD Audit Plus? Event Log Analyzer takes logs from your entire network. So this is more a wholesome approach for your network. So if you have Active Directory, if you have terminal servers, if you have file servers, if you have databases, what Event Log Analyzer does is it takes all those logs, right, brings them under one roof, using which you can search for specific logs and you can set up specific alerts, not just across Active Directory, but also across your other systems like Unix or Linux or SQL systems. The list goes on, right? And with an event log analyzer as well, you've got certain reports, but these are reports based on a network level or not an Active Directory level. For example, you see this Windows report right here. So if there are certain Windows events happening, like registry keys that were changed, right? Like any issues with Windows Start, right? Similarly, there are certain Linux and Unix reports here. For example, if users are executing commands, there are certain reports that you can leverage as well, and you can set up alerts on them, and you can set up a mitigation action for those alerts as well, right? So AD Audit Plus for Active Directory security, file or folder security. So this is more Active Directory centric. If you want to set up something more on a network level, on an OS level security, if you want to collect logs from other devices in your network and not just Active Directory, then Event Log Analyzer will do the trick. These two are modules of Log 360, Manage Engine Log 360. So if you purchase whatever you need, right, just in case you decide to purchase both of them, you can access them from one single console, that's Log 360. Right? So let me clear this out. Log 360 is the parent solution that hosts these two sub-modules. So you can purchase one module, use it as a standalone solution, and if you do choose to purchase multiple modules, you can access both of them from one parent console, that's Log 360. Here you go, here you got Event Log Analyzer and AD Audit Plus, both accessible from this one parent solution. Right? So there's a lot we looked into today. We saw areas that are unmonitored in Active Directory that must be monitored, areas that are misconfigured in Active Directory that can lead to incidents, default vulnerabilities in Active Directory that can lead to incidents, and Log 360 can help you with that, right? And before I end today's session, I have a little something for you. Here is something we've been working on for a long, long time. Now, this page is called IT security under attack, right? So over here, I've covered different attacks on Active Directory, on Azure Active Directory, and other environments like Windows and Linux environments. Do take a look at this because all the attacks that we performed today and many more attacks are in this, where you get to see how the attack works. You get to see a technical video simulation of the attack, and you get to see how you can leverage Log 360 to detect those attacks in your environments, right? So I'm going to quickly leave a link to this particular page on the chat window. So if you want to learn more about Active Directory attacks, how attackers could become domain admins, how privileges can be escalated, then this page will do that for you. And do bookmark this page because every month we will be adding in a new set of attacks that cover various infrastructures, not just Active Directory. All right. So that is about it for today. Thank you for your time. I hope the misconfigurations, the vulnerabilities, the areas that are left unmonitored, I hope these gave you sufficient insight on how attackers can traverse from being a non-privileged user to a domain admin. I hope you found this session informative. The slide deck will be sent to your email addresses, and the recording as well will be sent to your email addresses probably within the next 1 to 2 days.